Okay, welcome everyone. I'm David Rammel, editor of Virtualization and Cloud Review, here to moderate our first session of our Identity, Access Management, and Endpoint Protection Mini-Summit, brought to you by ManageEngine, a division of Zoho. Before we start today's two-session event, we do have some announcements. First, we wanted to let you know that this event is being recorded and will be available for future viewing. You'll receive an email when the replay is available, generally within the next few days. And each session will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A, so please be sure to put your questions into the Q&A area of your console as they come up so we can get them answered for you by our experts. Also, during today's second session, we will be giving away a DJI Mini 3 Pro drone, but you must be present to win, so be sure to stay on for the entire event. Finally, we do have resources from our sponsor, ManageEngine, a division of Zoho, available on the console right now, so please download and check those out. It's because of Zoho underwriting this content that we can bring you the summit, so we thank them for supporting the community and ask you to check out those resources so we can bring you more events in the future. Now on to the first session of today's mini-summit. What enterprises should know about identity management, authentication, and endpoint protection. This session features Ian Thornton-Trump, Chief Information Security Officer for Cyjax Limited and Chief Technical Officer for Octopi Managed Services, Inc., along with Chris Spinks, Head of Cyber Operations for Cyjax. Ian is an ITIL certified IT professional with 25 years of experience in IT security and information technology. He has deep experience with threats facing small, medium, and enterprise businesses. His research and experience have made him a sought-after cybersecurity consultant specializing in building security operations, working as a VCISO, and sharing his passion for building effective cyber threat intelligence programs for small, medium, and enterprise organizations. Chris Spinks, who is CEO of CyberForce Services, along with his position at Cyjax, has expertise from working in the cybersecurity space for many years, both with UK law enforcement as a police detective sergeant and cybercrime specialist supporting companies through digital forensics and incident response, as well as leading specialist teams for seeking to prosecute cyber criminals, including those buying and selling data as a commodity on the dark web. Through his 23 years in UK law enforcement, he worked with FBI, Homeland Security, Europol, and foreign cyber specialists providing an international response to cybercrime. Since being at Cyjax, Chris has continued to lead the team, bringing new talent into the industry, rocking the cyber skills gap boat with new thought leadership and insight, and continues to ensure that Cyjax operations team provides meaningful and actionable intelligence to its clients. Guys, it's great to have you here. Please take it away.
Thank you so much, David. And of course, huge shout out to Zoho who makes these things possible. And it's just lovely to have my colleague Chris along for this ride because as David indicated, Chris has a ton of experience in what happens when identity goes wrong. Welcome, Chris. Say hello.
Hey, Ian, and hello, everyone. Thanks for having me along. Great to be here and slightly embarrassed about the 2-year-old police car that comes with my my bio.
All right. Well, folks, this is a great moment because, as you know, especially if you've been around and following us since 2022 and into 2023, zero trust security is something that I've been talking about, and the pillars of zero trust, visibility, automation, and orchestration. I absolutely pound away at these topics along with the other tiers of the whole zero trust framework. But actually, you know, it was really great to get a little bit of editorial flexibility on this. in that we wanted to talk about when it all goes wrong and what the actual pain is from losing identities at a corporate level, and also to underscore the point that asking the tough questions of your organization, building the business case and the budget, and also making sure that the tooling that you have is suitable for today's threat environment. So what I want to do a bit is step away from all of the prescriptive, folksy wisdom that I usually give in these type of presentations and really capitalize on having Chris along to tell us about all of his experiences in dealing with folks that have suffered identity theft or endpoint compromise today. So, as we like to say, it's now time for something completely different. So in terms of talking points today, as we spend the next 20 or so minutes talking about identity management, I think Chris and I have sort of consensus view that the situation is not good, and Chris is going to wade in a little bit. But I think for the talking points, it's true to say that the loss of identity information is fueling a gigantic amount of fraud and is making it easier for cyber criminals to victimize people. I'm also pretty certain that based on what we're going to talk about today and some of the numbers that we're going to share with you, is that organizations are really failing to protect personal data of their customers and their employees, as we see that just here at home with the disclosure of the data from Royal Mail International, which was attacked by the Lockbit ransomware gang. And then, of course, the context of this is so vitally important. So I'm going to ask Chris now, to talk around some of his broad experience on what we're calling the endless nightmare of identity-fueled fraud.
Thanks, Ian. And yeah, you're absolutely right. Endless nightmare. And I think one of the main key points is that we don't really see an end in sight at the moment. I think a lot of that comes down to things you'll talk about later on. But let's have an explore through what I've seen through 23 years of policing and then a year and a half of head of operations, as well as running my own cybersecurity business. I started off in policing in the usual big tit hat, the hard hat that goes on the top of British police officers. Of course, we don't have guns over here, so we have to speak to people nicely and hope they don't hit us on the head, hence having a hard hat. But that hard hat didn't really protect me from the sorrow that was hitting me repeatedly from the victims that were seeing their bank accounts being drained, their social media accounts being hacked, their personal lives being absolutely tormented through disruption. And what I did see repeatedly was that they didn't know how this had happened. They would not be able to identify where they went wrong. They, of course, hadn't heard of multi-factor authentication. Most people at that time, a few years ago, were really not incorporating that into their own personal security. But we really started to see an explosion through the last 5 years of the fraud side that Ian has rightly identified. Now, one of the really interesting points that I came in the last couple of years of my career was when I was running teams, technical teams, to look at targeting the criminal infrastructure within the dark web. Now, these were very much websites that were designed to sell data. That might have been commodities through credentials, personal identifiable information, or even just credit cards, debit cards. One of the sites that we had openly displayed for people to purchase all the cards that were coming available. And that will come on in a couple of sites in a couple of slides' time, and I'll have a quick chat about it then. But one of the things we did was to actually look at the quantity of UK cards that were being made available through that site. My team was able to capture the personal identifiable information from that site and repatriate it through UK banking. We repatriated in 1 year 2.2 million cards. Each of those cards was through Home Office accounting looked at as having a £187.18 average cost of fraud associated with it. So by some very simple maths, 2.2 million cards times £187.18 is just under £412 million that my team of 5 people repatriated through British banking. And we were just scratching the surface. UK law enforcement, as we'll go on to say, and every other enforcement body through the world is not equipped for what we are seeing. That's a great slide to lead on to, Ian. I'll leave you to have a talk through.
Okay, because I want your input on this one too. But we can see where we're at with the global cost of financial fraud at a global level. It's increased by 6%. The number is astounding, where we've actually added almost $1 trillion on top of that particular stat. And basically what the call to action here is that this is not just a tax on corporations. Of course, corporations are going to be victimized in a lot of cases through the chargeback system, where fraudulent credit cards are used to purchase goods, and those goods are then perhaps sold to a third party. And that money is obviously it goes back in a lot of cases to the retailers, who inevitably end up swallowing the majority of this kind of loss. And it's absolutely astounding to me that your team of 5 individuals working on a daily basis can scrape up this information from the dark web and make a real impact on preventing crime. It's probably one of the most preventative things that can be done in terms of turning the fraud off. But you can see in the UK with the numbers that we have. Now, this came from a parliamentary report that was released early this year in 2023. So the data, of course, is from 2022. But you can see what a massive impact the loss of identity information. Now, there's a number of different ways to lose your identity. It can be anything from leaving your physical wallet and cards behind that can then be used fraudulently. But the majority of these data breaches that are occurring now are the direct result of massive data dumps that are being thrown out there onto the dark web. And Chris is going to talk a little bit more about that. Now, what is absolutely astounding about these UK stats, and Chris can attest to this because we had a central repository called Action Fraud here in the United Kingdom that was supposed to be the triage center, the intel center, if you were, to deal with the issues around fraud. Now, unfortunately, when you look at the massive increase in fraudulent activity, it ended up being for every police officer assigned to doing fraud investigations, domestically and international, with all the complications associated with an international investigation, you are sitting at about 2,000 open files per officer, which is, of course, to say not only demoralizing for the poor officers, but probably not the greatest service level that is required to assure the public and corporations that something is actually being done about this. Chris, do you want to comment a little bit about the inadequacy of taking one of the things that is causing the most financial harm and massively under-resourcing it?
Yeah, absolutely, Ian. You're absolutely right. 2,000 files sitting on my desk. How am I going to drink my coffee in the day if I've got to look at 2,000 files? But it is absolutely not something that an individual officer with very little training, when it comes down to the specialty of fraud investigation, technical investigations into data breaches, etc., it's not something that one officer or a group of officers is going to solve. This really is an international responsibility to look at problem solving on this. And it comes very much down to the InfoSec and CyberSec communities to drive this forward. One interesting point, Ian, and I see a lot of very big figures on here, but of course, fraud is not the only impact of lost data. And I had seen many times, unfortunately, both through personal lives of people involved with compromised credentials and also the corporate world, that people sadly were impacted greatly emotionally by the loss of their credentials, the loss of their money. And we did see on a number of occasions people who were either reaching out for professional help because of the impact, or unfortunately had committed suicide because of this impact. So it is not just something that comes down to these staggering figures. It's also the emotional, the mental toll that it takes on the individuals.
And it certainly takes on a sinister reign when things like the other criminal enablements. You talked a little bit about social media being leveraged in terms of fraudulent schemes, in terms of the exploitation of minors and things like that, which is all tied back to the loss of those credentials and the lack of things like protections like multi-factor authentication. And interestingly enough, a stat that really backs this is in the hoo-ha around Elon Musk removing SMS authentication for 2FA and Twitter. It was revealed that less than 2.5% of Twitter accounts have any sort of two-factor authentication activated to begin with. So that is absolutely horrific. And when it's an Instagram account, I've heard of influencers being held hostage and things demanded of them to get the return of account. You're absolutely right about just trying to equate it down to financial harm seems to devalue a little bit the overall societal impact. And we get to zoom in a little bit. We get to zoom in a little bit on how this occurs. So you want to talk a little bit about once the identity has been compromised and a bank account has been opened, and you can see their card cloning, ATM machines, all part of the ecosystem of fraud. Have you done investigations into these kind of operations, Chris?
I really have. Yeah, I really have, both into the purchase and the sale of the skimming machines, the effective deployment of them onto the ATMs, and also the end user. And repeatedly, we see that the pyramid of sale for the people that are deploying these machines comes back to organized crime. It comes back to crime bosses who are making millions out of this. Never on the land of the investigating body. They're always offshore with all these funds usually passing their way through into crypto and onto onshore accounts into fiat currencies that we're not going to see as UK or US law enforcement bodies. And it's a real shame to see that we still have to catch up with this global investigation means to be able to investigate these crimes. And one of the things I thought that was interesting from what you brought up there was about the multi-factor authentication. Of course, one of the things that happens with the stealing of credentials is that if one is browsing on your computer, and if everyone here listening considers what your browser history might have on it, if we get some stealer malware on there, some Redline stealer or something like this lurking on your computer, undetected by your antivirus, it's sitting there gobbling up, taking up all of the credentials that you're putting into everything. That is your name, your address, your passwords, your usernames for every single account that you log into on that browser. Now, some of those may be social media accounts, some of those may be email addresses, some of them may be more nefarious or less wholesome sites that you really wouldn't want other people to know about. And that presents real risk. It really presents an option for the criminal to look at having access to your email, which then, of course, may negate your multi-factor authentication because they can see the authenticated token coming through. Or indeed, maybe they can see what you've been logging on to and start to think that they can put leverage and blackmail onto the individual there to give access. Yeah. So even if the credentials themselves and your endpoint protection are in good shape, you've still got that insider threat risk that comes up. It's far bigger than just the card. It is organized crime, and it is very well organized.
And that's a beautiful segue to what we want to talk about next. This is a lot of data that is being made available on the dark web, purloined, if you will, from data breaches and financial institutions that get cyber attacked, where that data is exfiltrated. You can see the price lists there. But what we really are talking about is sort of the reason, the call to action, if you will, about why organizations in 2023 really need to focus on their identity and access management capabilities and the ability for them to protect these. I like to use this one in particular to talk a little bit about what happens here. And what we can see with the Colonial Pipeline breach, where the billing system essentially got a targeted attack by cyber actors, ransomed, and it shut down the pipeline, not as a physical attack on operational technology, or OT as we like to call it, but because Colonial Pipeline was unable to understand who was buying what anymore because of that system. Now, fascinating, just as individual identities are stolen to conduct fraud, and that has a bunch of repercussions, well, corporate identities get stolen as well. You can see that in 2021, there was a big list called RockU. On that list of identities that was contained in RockU were a set of credentials for Colonial Pipeline. And there's a really interesting juxtaposition here where the login, although it was outdated, the cyber threat actors were able to find a disused system that would provide access, so a VPN endpoint that didn't have multi-factor authentication in front of it, and those credentials, even though they were no longer in use in the organization, were able to authenticate to that VPN. That tells me a couple of takeaways from this, which are very, very interesting. We'll get into them in a moment. But it also shows that the hygiene and the understanding of that organizations in terms of lateral movement, using those credentials and probably using those credentials to gain better access, privileged accounts, resulted in this attack. And so I think what we can say pretty firmly, Chris, is that when identities are stolen, they lurk as a risk for quite some time in the organization if the endpoint hygiene, if the users and leavers program is not rigorously enforced.
That's exactly right, Ian. Exactly right. The data becomes available and available again and available again as the threat actors chuck it out onto the dark web to try and earn more money from it. And of course, if the hygiene isn't there for taking away data and for taking away users and looking at reducing access as people move on or change location, then that data, when it pops up again on breached forum or Russian forum or Genesis market, is just then suddenly giving a refreshed access into somewhere that you really don't want your threat actors getting. You're absolutely right on that, Ian.
And this is why one of the things that we have to talk about with regards to identity access management is a plea for complex passwords. Because if you get a public data breach that happens and your password is Spring 1969, okay, we probably know that Autumn 1969 may give us a route in, right? Or probably Fall, because no one can really spell autumn, right? But my point here is that it's not just about the credential that's stolen. It's if you have an easily guessed credential, or you're incrementing one digit, or you're doing something that you think is sophisticated. Quite frankly, the cyber criminals know human beings better than you might even know yourself, and you could lose that access quite easily, even though your original password may have been compromised. It's easy to predict the next password you might be using, right? Now,
I'm just changing my password from autumn. Just changing my password from autumn 1969. Thanks, Ian.
Now, this is the one that absolutely blows my mind, and I want to walk you through this particular attack because it really had all to do with identities that were contained within the Office 365 and or Exchange systems in use. Now, we're all familiar with the SolarWinds data breach and sort of what that led to. Now, the first arrow points to Office 365 and Exchange. Now, as a result of the SolarWinds compromise of Microsoft, a bunch of things happened. One was the compromise of Office 365 accounts. We're going to get to that in a moment. But it's easy to suggest that because source code for Microsoft Exchange on-premise servers was compromised in that data breach, this may explain the run of Microsoft Exchange zero-day remote code execution bugs, because the original code in the Exchange system to be compatible with all forms of SMTP, or Simple Mail Transport, contained legacy code probably going back to the 1970s and the 1980s. This code was reverse engineered by threat actors, and they were able to deliver, in one case, a massive blow to Rackspace Hosting, who hosted Exchange servers on behalf of other organizations, and those Exchange servers were not patched against these particular vulnerabilities. So we have a massive patient zero data breach that was then weaponized multiple times. There were multiple patches required for the Exchange platform because of its legacy nature. Now, in a more stunning part of this operation, the nation-state threat actors that compromised SolarWinds were able to penetrate the Office 365 some district attorney accounts for the Department of Justice. Now, why is this such an interesting thing? Well, they were able to bypass, in many cases, multi-factor authentication using what's called a golden SAML ticket, which managed to give them access to those accounts for an extended period of time without any sort of knowledge on behalf of the individual that was compromised. This then led to the ability of the bad guys to use the PACER system, which is the public access to court electronic records, to impersonate those district attorneys and gain access to potentially sensitive information such as grand jury deliberations and stuff like that that are in a protected part of the system. This is a phenomenal series of different pivots and hacks, including using 0 days attacks, but it all began with the compromise of an email account. Now, why is that so important? Because email is the way that we reset our passwords to a lot of third-party services that we use on a daily basis. And the way that is typically done is you say, I forgot my password. It then emails you a link to reset a new password. And this is why a lot of companies that understand this attack mechanism now send you a bunch of interesting telemetry about, hey, we note that you just changed your password on a system. Hey, we note that you just logged in from the Crimea. You know, is this really you? At least now, folks have woken up to the fact that their email is literally the keys to the castle. And at a corporate level or an organizational level, if that is compromised, the results can be devastating. So compromise of sensitive information becomes hugely linked to the identity of the people that are logging into your system. Chris, in your sort of policing, have you sort of seen where an email compromise or a set of email credentials has led to complete chaos within an organization or extreme difficulties for someone to clean up a cyber mess?
Yeah, frequently, unfortunately. And on the incident response that I've gone into, certainly both with the national level into the UK businesses that have been breached, you see time and time again, when you get back to the patient's area, it has come down to a compromised email address and a compromised email account. The problem you have, of course, is that, and you've spoken about nation threat actor, nation state actor here, But it's not just nation state that's looking for these juicy pieces of information, these juicy opportunities. Lots and lots of threat actors out there are just looking for an opportunity, and they are not looking to do it quickly. They are happy to sit. And I have seen numerous times that the credentials could be compromised, and lack of password changing, lack of password complexity on changes has then meant that the threat actor could compromise the email address down the line without anyone realizing, and gain access when they have the infrastructure themselves to then maximize the impact from it, whether that be data exfiltration or just causing the mayhem of ransomware. And of course, we should never forget and underestimate the mayhem and chaos of ransomware. But yeah, that's something that I've certainly seen on many occasions in.
Awesome. Now, I said I'd bring up the little zero trusty thing here, but I just want to highlight where you need to go with your Department of Identity and Access Management within your organization. I'm not going to read out every one of those, but I just want to pull out a couple of things where we've used some terminology that you may or may not be familiar with, but role-based access controls. These are parts of the Identity and Access Management Challenge so that you limit the amount of information that a user ID can get based on their role in the organization. The reason for this is twofold. One, of course, it's sort of containment, damage containment, if you're in the submarine. But the other side of this is would be then unusual for a software developer to be trying to access the payroll system within an environment. And because that role of the software developer is prohibited from access, that attempt can be sucked into a seam or something like that, and all of a sudden the attempt of lateral movement into a system that wasn't allowed and is prohibited based on that set of credentials can be easily identified. I think everyone's familiar with MFA and the desire to move away from SMS because some high-profile people with giant Bitcoin wallets had been compromised by very complex attacks involving duplication or interception of SMS. We've also seen malware that can be loaded onto endpoints as well. Now, the other one I want to really call out is about SSO and SAML. And SSO-enabled apps and SAML-enabled apps are a good thing. They need to be part of your IDAM or your IDM project or strategy because it's the only way you can gain some understanding about leavers and folks that are accessing third-party systems. And then when their access is revoked, against anything that is SSO enabled. And so what happened back in the day is the rush to the cloud and the rush to SaaS services that didn't have SSO means you're essentially turning the director or the VP or the managers into system administrators for their SaaS applications. The problem with that is that they might be not really competent or skilled. And so what happens is, although you revoke the credentials at, say, the Active Directory level, the credentials still exist on other systems that the IT department, because they're SaaS applications in use by a particular department or departments, you have no visibility or control over that, right? The other thing that I wanted to really point out here is there is a problem when you're talking about Office 365, SharePoint, Teams, and OneDrive in terms of data retention. And I call out preservation and litigation holds specifically because if you delete an identity in Office 365 and you don't pay for additional services, the data related, including the email, will be removed from the system as it would be removed from an individual OneDrive, right? Those accounts would be shut down. The problem is once they're shut down for, I think it can be as quick as like 14 days, that data is no longer available. So if you get sued by an organization 2 years later after there had been email negotiations with your account rep or salesperson, the organization literally has no data to refute the claims because it's gone. And so this is another issue. And we, back in the day when we had our on-premise Exchange servers, the one good thing, of course, before it exploded because it was neglected and everyone was afraid to patch it, was we could get access to those old accounts by archiving them into PST files. So your whole leavers process and preservation of the data that was generated in the course of the duties, you have to wrap some retention rules around that and have a process that basically takes into account vital information that might have been sent to a client. Now, we're running a little bit behind time, but I just want to pull this one out because we're going to get into part 2 of this presentation. We're going to have to go a little bit quicker. But the first and last rule of identity access management is really about a strategy, a plan, a proof of concept, communication to the business, execution, lessons learned, what did you just break, and then send the thank you notes for the to the business for helping support your initiative. I show a computer lab here because the one thing you don't want to do is massively change your information identity management in midstream without really making sure that you're not going to break and cause unanticipated downtime. So now we're going to pivot a little bit. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to come in on that. You're absolutely right. The lessons learned and the thanks has to be, in my view, surrounded by a no-blame environment, having a real honesty approach to what people are finding, to their lessons, to their failures, so they can come forward and the whole organization can learn from that. Sorry, Ian, I just interrupted.
No, that was brilliant because I think that was a great way to sum it up, Chris. Brilliant. So now we're going to talk a little bit about Endpoint. We're going to say some brief words about the fact that I think we're doing Endpoint management a little bit wrong. We're obsessed with these servers that we have, whether they're in the virtual space or whether that they're on premise. The reality is the servers don't, I would say they don't take into account, they don't surf the internet actively, right? And if you haven't exposed them to the internet through something crazy like Port Forward or something like that, I think generally our obsession about servers is misplaced in the modern threat era, where we should be focusing on those mobile endpoints that are logging into really dodgy places all the time, okay? So that's one issue. The second issue is IT devs and even security teams don't clean up their messes, right? They essentially will leave stuff, and it's really important that part of the decommissioning process is to actually turn these things off when they're no longer required in use and have an active way of making sure that they're removed from your system, because the more endpoints you have, the more risk you have. And if there's any ambiguity, like about the 20% of most IT asset management organizations, which is like we don't exactly know what we have, becomes a major risk factor in your endpoint hygiene, because if you can't find it, you can't protect it. And then I would say the other issue is the mergers and acquisitions and minimal viable integrations that we're doing leaves a lot of ambiguity. And really, like I like to call it out and say not everything is important in AD. And then the last part of this is really around the fact that we are in a different paradigm that even Microsoft is struggling with. So this definition of endpoints are physical devices that connect to the network system, such as mobile devices, okay, desktop computers, all right, virtual machines. Well, wait, didn't they just say physical devices? What do they mean, the hypervisor, or do they mean the stuff I have in the cloud? What? Embedded devices and servers. Well, embedded devices is pretty ambiguous, because does it mean IoT? Does it mean everything connected to Wi-Fi? Is an embedded device a printer? Is it a switch? And so no thanks to Microsoft here is a really difficult problem that isn't actually solved or even referenced by Microsoft is the fact that at the beginning of this, if you want to talk about endpoint and endpoint hygiene and minimum standards you need to have an SOP, a standard operating procedure, with definitions of what your business considers an endpoint and what adequate protections there are in place, as well as a policy that defines all of this. Because you're not going to be successful if you can't properly articulate to your organization what you mean when you say the word endpoint. So that's another kind of huge factor. And I think we'll just talk about this because, Chris, this is something I think, and I've used some language to read around enterprise, but in terms of quick wins, I mean, anybody can do this to their home computers, right?
Not just can, must. I think a lot of the stuff that you've written down here, the quick wins, are easily configurable under modern systems. In fact, they almost demand that you do it.
Yeah, and it breaks my heart because every Windows machine that comes out of the box and you install Windows 10 or Windows 11, it's got the spooler service running, by default, okay? And then it's got the server service running even if it will never share files, okay? And then we've got all sorts of other services that we may or may not need. And I know, like, if you're a hardcore gamer, you're turning off everything you can so you can get more FPS, frames per second, for your DPS, damage per second, right? But unless you're, like, at that level where you're tuning your computer for crazy performance, right? Most people don't realize that there are gaping vulnerabilities on their system. Like when we talk about the spooler service, for instance, right? There's no reason why a spooler service should be running in a virtual environment, right? Where are you going to print to? A virtual printer somewhere? So I think that's something that we really need to struggle with, is that Windows is amazing. It's flexible. I like to joke that it's Microsoft is a security company that just happens to build an operating system now. But the reality is that these machines are not hardened from the very beginning, and there's a path and route in going all the way back to the early exploitations of this Windows spooler service, a la Stuxnet, way back in the day. And I think this is a takeaway for folks to really engage with a professional, an MSP, an IT person, and see, can you harden my computer up and activate the security that it comes with and make sure I'm looked after, right? Okay, I'm going to now talk a little bit about the corporate issues when it comes to endpoints, all right? So the first is the vulnerability management program for the hardware, the operating system, and the applications has to be extended to all the different hardware that we have out there in our land. Now, it has to be a risk-based approach. We'll talk a little bit about that on the next slide. The other issue is cradle-to-grave CMDB updates and an annual refresh program. Because one of the most difficult things is coming into an environment and realizing that the configuration management database, i.e., what does it do, what value does it have to the business, and who owns it, are really important things to know, right? And this is where a lot of organizations are falling down on CMDB and asset discovery. There's also capabilities now when you're talking about endpoints is user and entity behavior analytics can be sucked in to give greater visibility on what that endpoint should be doing versus what it's doing now. And that's about anomaly detection that can be easily put in once you have sort of a collective understanding and some machine learning models about what normal behavior looks like. Again, I call out the idea of RBAC, of using role-based authentication, access controls to deploy the appropriate applications onto an endpoint for that particular role. I.e., if they're not an accountant, they maybe don't need access to the accounting programs deployed on their machine, and that access is provided by automation only when the role changes, okay? And then, of course, we talked about the dangers of SSO and SAML with third-party applications. If you've ceded control to the business on SaaS, and it's not SSO integrated, you're going to have a leavers policy that ensures that those accounts are terminated. Now, one of the great things about Office 365 is that you're financially incentivized to remove unneeded accounts and licensing because it costs you money on a monthly basis, right? But in a lot of cases, you'll find older legacy SaaS things are sort of like you buy it and then you can add as many users as you want, and there's a whole bunch of users that are no longer with the organization, and guess what? They still have valid credentials because a lot of SaaS applications don't have credential expiry at all, and they literally can be there and logged into years after the person is gone. And then, of course, the minimum security policies for managed and unmanaged devices that are requiring remote access. This is a fact of life that you're going to have to get used to, in that a lot of your corporate data is not going to be on corporate-controlled assets. It's a fact of life. And by that, I mean, if you look at the Teams application on your phone, you can get at things like OneDrive, you can get at things like SharePoint, and that might be happening over, a personal phone. So this is a reality of what we live in right now, and you're going to have to not only enforce minimum security policies, but adopt technologies in order to containerize your data or be able to do things like remote wipe your data, not the user's data, and keep those things separate. And so, as we sort of draw to a close, I talked broadly about some of the challenges that require, with the legacy issues with regards to legacy systems that don't support AD. You've got bad patches are a reality across the business. And so, test environments, test before deploy are really, really important. And I think this is the one where we get to be a little bit more of social engineers, Chris, is where we're asking the cooperation of the organization or the individual to help secure the data that we're supposed to be custodially responsible for, yeah? Can you talk a little bit about, security always becomes really important after the fact that the individual or the organization has been hurt?
Absolutely, it's the only time that the C-suite will listen to the to the security advisors asking for more money. But you're right, it's that hearts and minds approach across the whole business. I know ISO 27001 very much looks at bringing in that risk managed approach across the whole business. And that's because you have to get buy-in from the top and the bottom, with everyone paying and looking at those security controls and the relevance of them. And I think it's really very much more now that we've seen since 2020 with COVID and all of our bring your own devices and corporate devices being thrown into the landscape of home offices, that we're really seeing that necessity for the user and entity behavior analytics, certainly, and those minimum security policies to run around that. I think you're absolutely right on those points, Ian.
Awesome. So I guess where we're going now, and this is sort of like, what does the map look like for your organization, is to really look at your complete coverage of your endpoints from an EDR or managed detection and response perspective. Because if you're like ignoring and have decided that Red Hat is out of scope for your organization, the organization is going to suffer probably pretty significantly if you're leaving that gaping hole in your armor. And then the other issue really is around a SIEM that can collect from both places, the cloud and virtual environments that you're running, virtual endpoints as I call them, and the physical on-premise. Because one of two things are going to happen. An on-premise endpoint is going to get compromised, and the first thing the folks will try and do is move into or find virtual credentials, because they know that that's probably where the majority of your consumer-facing systems are, which gives you the big prize of holding data hostage and, of course, rendering your systems unavailable, amping up the amount of economic loss. And these two next things I think are really important because vulnerability management descends in a lot of organizations into the hysterics. But it's really important to be aware that a CVE 9 might be very bad, but because of all of the investments that we made in cybersecurity, a web application firewall, for instance, a global CDN, microsegmentation, all of these type of techniques that you can use to isolate it, the CVE rating is no longer a 9 for your organization, right? So this is another concept that I think we need to start applying intelligence to, is to really understand what risk is within your organization and understand that based on your tech stack, based on your capabilities, it may vary, right? So outcomes may vary, I think, is the takeaway here. And then, of course, things like techniques to work around the actual problems in OT or IT environments, like microsegmentation for that unpatchable legacy stuff, things they call data diodes that will only let data go one direction and won't allow for data to go back into systems. This is frequently used in OT environments by deploying technology called a waterfall firewall. There's other manufacturers, but the one I'm familiar with is a Waterfall's offering in that OT space. And then, the big takeaway that really, I think, differentiates your endpoint strategy is whether or not you're monitoring the disaster recovery status for those critical business systems. And I put daily. Some organizations are snapshotting every couple of hours. But it's really important to make sure that you have a fallback and that the ultimate Alamo, if you will, is the DR status of those systems. And then, of course, just go by the rule of thumb. The oldest system in your organization is usually the most vulnerable system, and advocate for its replacement. Break down doors in your company to talk to the owners of those old systems and work with them, provide them resources, provide them bribes, provide them a puppy or a giant bottle of champagne. But the sooner you can get those systems off of the network and invest in technologies to either isolate them or move them to somewhere else, the better for your organization, because your whole security posture will be improved dramatically as you address those old on-premise systems or even older operating systems that you virtualized in the cloud. So that is sort of our roundabout way of going back to the original slide here to talk about the journey and not the destination. Look, both Chris and I have talked about the real human impacts of failure to protect those identities at a corporate and individual level, and that how endpoint security now is far bigger than worrying about patching of your servers. It's a massive undertaking. And I guess what we're trying to say is that this is now a journey for your organization towards zero trust. It is not a destination. It may be a work in progress for years, depending on how many legacy systems and poorly configured and best practices that were ignored early on in the days. So for me, working at the corporate level, this is the call to action, and I would say start your journey by getting a grip and figuring out who's working for you, and if they are working for you, how you're going to manage their identity across the virtual world, the SaaS world, third-party applications, and, of course, at home inside the corporate network where it's, arguably a little bit safer than being out on the internet. Chris, do you have any advice for individuals, I guess, is probably the best way, those individuals that don't have one of these protecting them?
You just got to be very aware of your credentials and protect them almost with your life. MFA, moving away from SMS, if you've already said, is absolutely going to give you the key to looking at protection of your assets across the organization. And that absolutely comes for policies that are looking at password change, frequency of password change, getting rid of that old device on the network and looking at the endpoints and understanding that endpoint landscape. Absolutely spot on points, and comes down to your final slide here, really. I think it's that credentials are your keys.
Yeah. And you know what? There's so many great and free tools. We put up Have I Been Pwned there. Sajex itself offers a credential monitoring for exposure on dark web data breaches as well. These are the new realities, is that identity is basically the keys to the castle, and you need to protect this. It's probably the number one thing that, that you need to do in 2023 is secure your employees' credentials, and of course, secure those customers' credentials, because you don't want your data breach to be responsible for pain and misery on behalf of those customers that you've worked so hard to get their business. All right, and with that, we go back to David Remmel, who is going to ask us all the tough questions.
Okay, great job, guys. And we do have some questions from the audience, so let's get right to them. We've got about 4 minutes or so before the top of the hour and our next session. So here's a question from Diane in the audience, works for the city of Boston. Can you explain what endpoint protection does that anti-malware doesn't?
Right. So this is a good thing in that not all of the data breaches that we face today are malware driven. They can be a compromised employee, like Chris said, that is motivated now to steal data. But what we're talking about is endpoint protection in a holistic sense of building various means of both proactively responding to and detecting activity that looks potentially like a compromise of some sort, right? Because anti-malware, basically, if it can't detect that there's malware on an endpoint, perhaps a massive transfer of data would set off alarm bells with a endpoint protection policy in place that includes things like SIEM, managed detection and response, things that are happening at the network layer that the SIEM may pick up on. So it's really around figuring out how you're going to protect the endpoints from the type of threat models that you'll see. I can say with certainty that one of the best resources to figure out what your endpoint protection strategy should be is going to the Verizon data breach and looking up public services and going through the most likely threat scenarios and saying, how are we going to protect our users from, phishing email? That's part of your endpoint protection strategy. But how are we going to protect our organization when somebody's trying to move into the accounting department? That's a key thing as well. And so that's the philosophy. Chris, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was just going to add to that, Ian. You're absolutely right. But one of the key points that you brought up is that holistic view from the endpoint protection. Antivirus is only good after the fact. You've got infected, you're already hit by it. But we do know from the work we've done over many threat actors, including Conti, TrickBot, Wizard Spider Group, that they really invested a lot of time into cryptors that were enabling them to deploy RATs, remote access tools, and other malicious devices onto machines without breaching or without getting detection from anti-malware. And so that means that having the endpoint detection, the endpoint protection process in place, you're picking up changes to the environment that would not necessarily trigger through an AV.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. Let's get Steve's question answered too, because this is a really, really good one, and my heart goes out to Steve. I'll tell you that right now.
Yeah. Steve says, after living through two breaches and several disruptive events, the biggest hurdle identified after the fact was that security competed for priority against IT and reported to the CIO. What do you guys have to say about that?
I have to say that they're not trying to do zero trust or do it right. The idea that they're competing for priority is kind of ridiculous, but I understand why that's the case. IT are sometimes the hands to keyboards. They're the ones that are patching servers and scheduling downtime with the business at the behest of security. I know a lot of security organizations that unless it's an incident and digital forensics response is required, they do the vulnerability scans and then they prioritize that and hand it off to IT to do their job. This, to me, sounds like the wrong type of management structure to be successful, that I think everyone needs to be part and included as part of the security mission within the organization, and understand that if you look at the direction of travel from Microsoft, they're making no bones about it based on the tools that they're putting onto the marketplace, that IT is security and security is IT. And that's a really interesting kind of change in the philosophy that we've seen. And I think this is why, if there's silos within your organization, like poor Steve has suffered through, if there's silos, that's where the threat actors are going to strike, 100%.
Okay, great stuff. And that's a wrap. So thanks again, Ian and Chris, for an excellent presentation and answering all those questions.
Thanks for having us.
Oh, you're welcome, David. Yeah, thank you.